Hi, I'm Jane from Night Owl Speaks, and welcome to my two-part series which attempts to understand the defence mechanisms that we humans use in our everyday dealings with others. So let's get started. Now, there's a certain vulnerability that comes with being human. From the day we are born, we are trying to make sense of and adapt to the physical world. Certain defensive mechanisms come into existence from day one, and depending on our individual circumstances and natures, they help to shape who we are. This presentation examines what defence mechanisms are and how they arise. It also looks at the more everyday strategies that people use to preserve self-esteem and avoid disappointments. So what is a defence mechanism? A psychological defence mechanism is a strategy that we use to protect our sense of self. It is an ego-based structure around which we may have some awareness, or it may be hidden within our subconscious mind. Defence mechanisms lead to certain behaviours, which generally serve to allay anxiety and preserve our self-esteem. Now, defence mechanisms range from the relatively healthy, which make us more skillful in our dealings with others, to the unhealthy or even pathological, which can severely undermine or damage our relationships. Now, is there really a healthy level of defensiveness? I think yes. Many people have a balanced notion of self-preservation. They're not too submissive and people-pleasing, nor are they too aggressive. They are also able to contextualise their own behaviours and potentially work more in harmony with others. They set appropriate boundaries for themselves and around others, and are discreet where necessary. They use their observations, instincts, and insight to rapidly adapt their behaviour if and when necessary. They are emotionally competent and skillful at observing verbal and non-verbal cues, including body language and word usage, which includes vocal tone. And they will almost certainly heed those red flags that many of us miss and react in a manner that reflects a positive self-regard. They will generally not be defensive if people relate to them in a respectful and equal manner. And when their instincts make them feel uncomfortable around certain people, then they know that there's a need to self-protect and withdraw if necessary. But they also know when to assert themselves. And if the person has a well-defined sense of self and a healthy ego structure, then they will not have any doubt or anxiety around how they deal with others. So I'd just like to give you a quick example of an appropriate healthy defensive strategy. Jenna has a work colleague called Sue, whose behaviour and attitudes don't really match her own value system. Sue is negative and overly critical of others. She's rather a gossip and very consumptive in her style. And she's always inviting Jenna over for a drink or on some outing or other. Jenna heeded the early warning signs and politely declines these invitations. And she's very comfortable with this strategy. I'd just like to say that this type of strategy works so much better in the long term. If you can nip in the bud a potential problem before it takes hold, then you don't find yourself having to retreat later. She appropriately read the signs and didn't even bother going there. Now, defence mechanisms arise from the day we are born. Healthy ones arise from consistent and positive role modelling shown by significant attachment figures. This usually creates the environment for a child to feel safe and secure. Maladaptive defences can be formed from insecure attachment and aberrant and poor role modelling. And if a child has experienced trauma and abuse, then they are more likely to have deeply entrenched and extreme defence mechanisms. They would be much more difficult to revise and break down, as they serve as a kind of protective coat of armour. And as children, nature, or in other words our genetics, and nurture interact in a complex matrix that forms the personality of the child. And this personality includes our self-protective strategies. And indeed, it was Woody Harrelson's succinct comment that summed it all up. He said that adults are merely children with layers on. And we can pretty much conclude that he was actually talking about defense mechanisms. And so, what happens when you have unhealed childhood wounds? Well, you are more likely to have abnormal defense mechanisms, and the fundamentally human traits such as trust, empathy, unconditional love, and respect for self and others will be filtered through a slightly distorted lens. And as a result, your relationships can often be less fulfilling, hard work, and difficult to maintain. Unhealthy defenses often lead to acts of sabotage within relationships. And this is compounded if you have two wounded people that have magnetically been drawn together. Interestingly, even good enough parenting doesn't leave you immune to having maladaptive defenses. There really aren't any real absolutes in life. Influences from the broader society can leave their mark too. There could be all sorts of trauma associated with bullying, accidents, illnesses, loss, or even separation from caregivers. And people with sensitive temperaments may be particularly vulnerable. But in general, people who are heavily and abnormally defended have had decidedly suboptimal childhood rearing. So, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are the more everyday defense mechanisms that people use? These are not necessarily unhealthy and injurious to oneself or others, but they still serve the purpose of protecting self-esteem and avoiding disappointments, etc. So let's start with intellectualization. A person might talk about feelings in a left brain way, but the emotion that often accompanies certain feelings might appear to be absent. It's been kind of stripped away. And this strategy perhaps is an attempt to avoid emotional pain. Perhaps there's a disconnect between thinking and feeling. Let's think of an example with Jan here. So, question. How did you feel, Jan, when Dave shouted at you? Response. Well, I think that's not a nice thing to do. So do you notice there the use of the word think instead of feel? Now, rationalization is another easily recognized everyday defense that we all use. It's relatively harmless. And this is when we attempt to make sense out of certain situations. It's often a compensation for disappointment. So look at Charlotte here. Her holiday has been cancelled, and she rationalizes, well, maybe it's for the best. At least I can get some jobs done around the house. It's another intellectual defense, really, and I guess what's happening here again is it's an avoidance of feeling. Now, moralizing is another intellectual defense, and there may be many reasons why people do this. The technical meaning of moralizing is to reflect on or express opinions about something in terms of right and wrong. And onlookers often see this as quite self-righteous and tiresome. It can sometimes be a self-righteous stance that justifies behaviour. For example, I only told you what Helen said about you behind your back because you have a moral right to know, and it's for your own good. Now that kind of moralising smacks a little of a superior stance, which differs from having solid moral principles that form part of a personal value system. And from that value system, you use it occasionally to make a point. Now, regression. We are all familiar with becoming more childlike in certain stressful situations, or non-stressful situations sometimes. We occasionally complain, become needy and irritable, and sometimes cute, but it's all fairly harmless. However, pathological regression can be seen in emotionally damaged individuals. This emotionally damaged adult lets the child run the show, and the behaviour can be destructive to themselves and others. Please tune in to my narcissists and toxic people presentations to get more of an idea about how these primitive defences get played out. Now, isolation is another common defence, and this is when potential emotional overload and distress is avoided by separating out feeling from knowing. And this surgeon here, he has to isolate his feelings in order to get the job done efficiently. Now, compartmentalization is another intellectual defense. And this is basically when certain ideas or values are separated out in order to avoid a clash, an internal clash in the mind. It's a coping strategy. Things are literally put into little compartments in the mind. I'll give you an example. Tom believes himself to be non-sexist, but is quietly amused by a politically incorrect sexist joke. Or, in principle, Zoe believes that infidelity is morally wrong, but is able to compartmentalise her own indiscretions. Repression, which was acknowledged by Freud initially, this is when we repress memories of upsetting thoughts or behaviours. It's a kind of out of sight, out of mind principle. For instance, on a minor level, we may forget the details of an argument that we had with our partner because it's very upsetting. And on a deeper level, trauma survivors often repress memories very deeply because they would be too painful to bring into conscious awareness. Now, displacement is an emotional response that is literally displaced elsewhere. For example, Simon's boss yelled at him this afternoon, and he displaces his unexpressed anger onto his spouse and this poor dog here when he comes home from work. There are many forms of defence mechanisms that I won't go into, but you might be interested yourself in looking them up, and they are projective identification, sexualization, and sublimation. And to gain more of an understanding on how we humans defend ourselves psychologically, please tune in to part 2. I'm Jane from Night Owl Speaks, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.